Come to a standing position on your mat, arms overhead, taking in some nice breaths here. Forward fold, maybe bend one knee and then the other. This practices a lot of flow from swan dive all the way into a up dog and to down dog. So nice and slow and steady with lots of movement. In that standing position, feel free to grab one wrist and bend to the side for a nice side stretch, and grab the other wrist and bend to the other side. Maybe a little back bend, or just taking in some deep breaths and finding some space here in a forward fold, halfway lift, forward fold, reverse swan dive up, arms overhead. Nice back bend if you can. And forward fold, halfway lift. And plant the hands and hop or step back into high plank, half lower into up dog, push back into down dog. Bend one knee and then the other. You can walk that dog. Actively pushing the hands and forearms into your mat. Taking one more breath in for this down dog. Deeply bend the knees, hop or step forward to a forward fold, halfway lift. And again, bending one knee and then the other in a forward fold. It's a nice lower back stretch. Arms overhead, reverse swan dive up and swan dive down. Plant the hands, hop or step back into high plank, half lower into up dog. Pushing back into down dog. We're going to do a lot of this flow. Lots of active movements in this session. Deeply bend the knees, hop or step forward, halfway lift, forward fold, reverse swan dive up, arms overhead, and swan dive down. Plant the hands and hop or step back into high plank. Stay here for an extended plank. This is a simple yet very effective move. And plant the right hand and open up into side plank, left arm overhead. You can kick that left leg behind you and open up that side. Stretch just a little bit more. Coming back to side plank, keeping those hips high. Don't let them drop. And come down into high plank. And getting ready to plant the left arm, right arm overhead for side plank on the other side. And if you want to, you can kick that right leg back behind you and open up that right arm back behind you for a nice opening stretch. Back to side plank. And drop the arm down into high plank. And lower onto the forearms for a lower plank. And back up to high plank. We're going to go back and forth in this, a little strengthener. Forearms down to the mat in low plank. Hands up, tall, shoulders tall for high plank, and then push back into down dog. And deeply bend the knees, hop or step forward, and halfway lift. Forward fold. Reverse swan dive up, arms overhead, and swan dive down. Plant the hands and hop or step back into high plank, half lower into up dog. Push back into down dog. Deeply bend the knees, hop or step forward, Halfway lift, forward fold, reverse swan dive up, arms overhead, and swan dive down. You can kind of get into a rhythm of breathing on these flows. Then hopper step back, halfway lower into up dog, push back into down dog. Deeply bend the knees, hopper step forward, halfway lift, forward fold into reverse swan dive up, arms overhead, and swan dive down. Plant the hands, hopper step back into high plank, half lower into up dog, push back into down dog. Deeply bend the knees, hopper step forward. Bend the right knee, and then keep the right knee bent. Plant the right hand and open up that left arm overhead for a nice spinal twist and a lower back stretch. And switch sides, bend the left knee, plant the left palm, raise the right arm overhead. And plant the right palm. And halfway lift. Forward fold, reverse swan dive up, arms overhead. Swan dive down. Halfway lift. Forward fold. Reverse swan dive up, arms overhead. And drop your arms down to your side. And arms straight up overhead for a chair pose. Remember to tuck that tailbone under. Don't arch your back. Keep it as straight and long as possible, keeping everything tight. Draw your hands together and twist to your left. Back up to chair pose, centered. Again, tuck that tailbone in. And draw your hands together, twist to the right. And back to center. Holding that chair pose, holding it just a little longer. And straighten arms overhead. Swan dive down. Plant the hands and hopper step back into high plank. Halfway lower into up dog. Push back into down dog. Deeply bend the knees, hopper step forward. Halfway lift. Forward fold to reverse swan dive up, arms overhead. And swan dive down. Plant the palms and hopper step back. Halfway lower into up dog, pushing back into down dog. Again, lots of flows in this session. Deeply bend the knees, hopper step forward, halfway lift. Arms overhead, swan dive down. Plant the palms and hopper step back. You know the drill. Again, it's easy to get into a nice flow, a nice rhythm of breathing with these extended and continued flows. Halfway lift, forward fold. And hopper step back into high plank. Kick the right leg forward, feet between the hands. Plant the left palm, raise the right arm overhead for a nice side stretch. Plant the palm and hop up into high crescent lunge, arms overhead. Spiral open into warrior two, deeply bending into this, dropping your hips, reaching forward as much as you can, and then reversing that warrior. Right arm overhead. And spiraling forward, right arm on right knee, left arm overhead. And plant the hands and step the right foot back. Push back into down dog for just a little break. Caterpillar forward to high plank and kick that left foot in between the two hands, opening up to the left, left arm overhead. Drop your hand and rise up into high crescent lunge, arms overhead. Pivot open into warrior two, sinking those hips as much as you can into that stretch, reaching forward and then flipping that warrior. And spiral forward for a nice opening up front with right arm overhead, left arm resting on the left leg. Spiral the hands down and kick that foot back into down dog. Again, deeply bend the knees, hopper step forward. Going through this flow again. You know it, halfway lift. Reverse swan dive up, arms overhead. Swan dive down. Plant the hands and hopper step back into high plank. Half lower into up dog. Pushing back into down dog. Deeply bend the knees, hopper step forward, halfway lift. Forward fold into reverse swan dive up, arms overhead. Swan dive down. Plant the hands and hopper step back into high plank, half lower into up dog. Pushing back into down dog. You should be in a nice rhythm now. Deeply bend the knees, hopper step forward, halfway lift. Reverse swan dive up, arms overhead. And swan dive down. Deeply bend the knees and hopper step back, half lower into up dog. Pushing back into down dog. Take a breath here in down dog. Staying here for just a few moments in this nice down dog with a nice stretch. And slowly drop the knees, coming into a neutral tabletop. I'm going to do some cat-cows here, arching that back, taking a breath in, and exhaling and inflating the entire torso and arching up. Keep doing these. Another nice rhythmic inhale and exhale. And again, inhaling and exhaling. Come to neutral tabletop. Extend the arms just a little bit further out in front of you and kick that right leg back behind you for a low push-up, kind of a half push-up. And again, dropping down into that half push-up. And again, pushing down into that push-up. And again, and drop that right knee. Kick the left leg back behind you. Push down into a half push-up. These make you nice and strong. Encourage good balance. Just a few more here. And drop the left knee, push back into child's pose. You can spread the knees, touch the toes. I like doing an active child's pose where my forearms and my hands are pushing into my mat, pushing my hips down onto my heels. Trying to work on my hip flexibility. And push back into down dog. Deeply bend the knees, hopper step forward, halfway lift. Reverse swan dive up, arms overhead, and swan dive down. You know the flow, you know the drill. into up dog, pushing back into down dog. I'm going to go through this flow a couple times. Halfway lift. Reverse swan dive up, arms overhead. Swan dive down. Deeply bend the knees, hop or step back, half lower into up dog. Pushing back into down dog. Again, make sure to have slow and rhythmic breathing here. Hop or step forward, halfway lift. Reverse swan dive up, arms overhead. And swan dive down. Hop or step back, halfway lower into up dog. Pushing back into down dog. I feel like these are deep cleansing flows that feel really good. Go ahead and kick the left leg back behind you, bend the knee and stack the hips. If you can, slowly and carefully flip your dog. I feel like this is appropriate with Root hanging out on the mat with us. This is a nice chest opener. Go ahead and come back to down dog. Kick the right leg back out behind you, bend the knee and stack the hips. And slowly and carefully you can flip your dog, extending long and reaching out in front of you. And come back to down dog. Deeply bend the knees, hop or step forward, halfway lift. Reverse swan dive up, arms overhead, and swan dive down. Halfway lift, forward fold, hop or step back, half lower into up dog. Pushing back into down dog. Deeply bend the knees, hop or step forward, halfway lift. Forward fold, reverse swan dive up, arms overhead. And forward fold. Hop or step back into high plank, half lower into up dog. Push back into down dog. Deeply bend the knees, hop or step forward, halfway lift. Forward fold. And hop back into high plank, push down into up dog, pushing back into down dog. Hop or step forward, halfway lift. Reverse swan dive up, arms overhead, and swan dive down. And come to a seated position, drop down on your mat. Hug your knees and roll backwards, hugging your knees. Moving around just a little bit there. Stretch out long, arms overhead, legs outstretched in front of you. Bend the left knee up and release. Bend the right knee up and release. And keep alternating legs, kind of like you're imagining something that you're stepping up on, but you're laying down on the ground. And then put them together for some bicycle kicks. A nice little core move, engaging the core, trying to keep that back and spine flat on your mat. And keep going just a little bit longer, keeping everything tight and engaged. And hug your knees to your chest. And drop your legs, stretch your arms out into a T. Kick your left leg out straight, look to the left. Nice little star pose for a nice spinal twist to finish up this session. And rotate the other direction, kick that right leg out across the body and look to the right. Taking some final breaths here. Legs outstretched, arms outstretched, final breath of this session. And hands to heart, namaste.